Hello, everyone, and happy today. We know we've got the skeleton made of all these bones, but one thing you need to do is let these bones interact with one another or move. If we've got this skeleton that provides support and protection, but the skeleton can't move and reposition itself, nobody's going anywhere. So, in this lecture, we look at the different types of joints that exist between all these different bones of the body. So, what is a joint? A joint is considered an articulation. Articulations are the interactions or the physical space where bones meet. And again, by having different types of articulations, by having different types of joints, it allows different types of movements between the various bones. So we can categorize bones in different ways, and we can categorize them functionally by the types of movement or the degree of movement they allow, or we can classify them structurally, like how they're built. So let's start first with the functional definition or classification of joints. Synarthroses. Arthur means joint, and syn means together. So with synarthrotic joints, the bones are basically fused together and they don't move. That's what we see in the sutures of the skull. So we have these individual bones, but they basically get stitched together by proteins and they are immovable. They're locked in place. It's a joint, but it's a joint that doesn't allow any sort of movement between the bones. So that is synarthrotic. Amphi, think of like amphibious. Amphi means both. So amphiarthrotic joints both provide stability and a little bit of movement. Okay, we have amphiarthrotic joints between our vertebrae. If you think, you can bend your back quite a bit, but that's bending all the vertebrae. Each individual joint between the vertebrae moves only very little. So an individual joint in the spine only moves a little bit, but overall, if you stack a bunch of them together, you can get a fair amount of movement. But amphiarthrotic joints only move slightly. That also includes the pubic symphysis. That's that disc at the front of the pelvis between the two pubic bones. It allows just a little bit of movement or a little bit of wiggle in the pelvis. So like if you're running and you're transferring force between the two sides of your pelvis, you can now allow a little bit of movement. It also provides some flexibility to the pelvis during childbirth. And then finally, diarthrotic joints. Dia means across. So diarthrotic joints we find in the appendicular skeleton where we have a large degree of movement. So synarthrotic doesn't move at all. Amphiarthrotic moves a little bit, and diarthrotic moves a lot. Now let's contrast this with the structural classifications. This is basically sort of how they're built. So synarthrotic joints that don't move structurally are considered fibrous joints. They're considered fibrous because between the bones, you have these protein fibers stitching them together. So fibrous joints are stitched together by proteins. That's a structural definition. Functionally, they're synarthrotic. They don't move. Cartilaginous joints. Again, this is a structural definition. Cartilaginous joints have those fibrocartilage discs. They're these discs of connective tissue with lots of proteins in them. And that's what we see between the vertebrae. So again, they're referred to as inter means between, intervertebral discs. So cartilaginous joints have these cartilage pads filled with proteins. And again, they allow a little bit of movement. That's our amphiarthrotic joints. And then finally, the diarthrotic joints, the freely movable ones, those are synovial joints. We learned about synovial membranes in the last chapter. Synovial joints have this articular capsule, so it's basically a connective tissue capsule, and in that is that synovial fluid. Now, since these joints move a lot more, we have a fluid in the joint space to help reduce friction between those bones and provide a little bit of cushion between the bones. And again, these structurally synovial joints are diarthrotic, they're freely moving. Now let's look a little bit more into synovial joints. The joint cavity, again, it has that synovial fluid to decrease friction. You'll have ligaments, and ligaments stitch bone to bone. So ligaments hold those joints together. And then to provide some extra padding, if you will, there are bursae or tendon sheaths. Bursae are like little membranous sacs filled with fluid, and you'll have bursae or a bursa sac between tendons and bones. So tendons connect muscles to bones. So when your muscles contract and move those bones, the tendons can rub against the bones. So the bursae act like little sacs, like little fluid-filled sacs, or like little baggies of water that help reduce friction when those tendons are moving over the bones. And you can even have tendon sheaths. I think of those. I don't know if you've ever seen like the little toy. It's like a rubbery bag and it's filled with water and like glitter, and you can like hold it gently, and then the inside turns out and like rolls out of your hand. That's sort of what tendon sheaths are like. But what they do is they have that watery membrane wrapped around the end of a tendon. So again, it decreases friction. Okay, let's get into the types of synovial joints. The first type of synovial joint is a plane joint. Plane joints are found between the short bones in the wrist and the ankle. And these joints only allow just a little bit of movement. So in a plane joint, again, you don't get a little bit of movement. You just get a little slippage between those bones to allow, again, a little bit of give in case there's a lot of force. With a hinge joint, there's all this cylindrical on one end, blah, 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 blah. Here's the thing. With a hinge joint, recognize that it's uniaxial. That means it basically opens and closes. Your elbow is a hinge joint. Your knee is a hinge joint. Between your phalanges, hinge joint, opens and closes. Okay? Now, contrast this with a pivot joint. If you think about people playing basketball, if they pivot, they have one foot that stays stationary, and then they can turn around that one foot. Well, in a pivot joint, that's what we have between your radius and the capitulum at the end of your humerus. It's a rounded end of one bone and a rounded end of another bone, and it allows them to rotate around one another. So the pivot joint you see allows you to turn your wrist over. Okay. So that's the radio-ulnar joint. So that's the joint between the radius and the ulna. Again, you can rotate around there. Condylar joint. Again, it's sort of an egg-shaped joint. This allows a biaxial motion. It's wordy. Metacarpophalangeal joint. Your phalanges are your fingers. Your metacarpals are your palms. And so it allows you to do this. Tap, tap, tap. Wag, wag, wag. So it's biaxial. Up, down, side to side. So that's the condylar joint, basically in your knuckles. Okay? And then a saddle joint looks like a horse saddle. So you can sort of see this here. Or if you want to put it in snack chip terms, think of like some Pringles sitting on top of one another. So they have this sort of saddle shape to them. And what that does, this is the carpometacarpal joint. So carpus is your wrist, metacarpal in your thumb. It allows you to twiddle your thumbs. Okay? So condylar joints are tap, tap, wag, wag. Saddle joints are twiddling thumbs. And then finally, one that's probably really relatable, ball and socket joint. So ball and socket joints have a rounded head and a rounded socket, and that gives greater range of motion. So the cool thing about ball and socket joints, it's at our shoulders and our hips, so we can position those joints all over the place. So ball and socket has a really great range of motion, and then your elbow is a hinge, and then between your phalanges, those are also hinge joints. So you can use a ball and socket to position your extremity wherever you want, use that hinge joint in your elbow to extend, and then use hinge joints to grasp. So really, the layout of the body is pretty spectacular because you've got a range of motion at the attachment point to the trunk, and then you can position those hands and then grasp with the hands and do whatever you need. So a nice combination of joints. Think about the types of movements that are possible in these joints. Flexion decreases the angle of the joint. So if you flex, you're decreasing the angle. Extension is to increase the angle of the joint. Add and abduction. Ab means away from, like if a person is absent, he or she's away from school. So with abduction, you're going away from the midline of the body. Add means to, so that means you're moving toward the midline of the body. Let's see, circumduction. Circumduction, you're making circles. You've got like a small circle at the proximal end and a larger circle at the distal end. So circumduction, you're making circles. Pronate and supinate. Supination is palms up. Think about you're holding a cup of soup. Prone is palms down. Your hand is prone. And then finally, our feet do some funky things. you can turn in the bottom of your foot. That's inversion. And then to evert means to turn the foot out. So I just think you have like an introverted foot, a little shy foot, and then an everted foot, like an extroverted foot. And of course, we always finish with terrible things that can happen. Remember bursae? Those are the little sacs between bones and tendons to help decrease friction. Well, sometimes people can bang those up and get bursitis or inflammation. Again, that can be painful to move the joint. And then arthritis. Arthur means joint, itis means inflammation of. So arthritis is something that virtually everybody that lives long enough experiences to some degree or another. So there's osteoarthritis, which is just your standard getting old arthritis. What happens is the cartilage that covers the ends of those joints doesn't have a blood supply. So it's really difficult for the chondrocytes there to make new cartilage. So it doesn't repair itself particularly well. So if you just work on that joint over time, it'll grind itself down. And then you have bone grinding on bone. You get bone spurs and stuff like that. Rheumatoid arthritis occurs when your immune system actually attacks tissues and joints. So your immune system destroys that stuff. And then gouty arthritis. With gout, you can have uric acid crystals created, and you really don't want crystals in the body because those crystals will shred your joints. So if people have recurrent experiences with gout, recurrent bouts of gout, then that can chew up and destroy the cartilage in joints. So the big thing is to just keep weight down as much as possible and keep moving and be varied in your activity. If people perform the same motion over and over and over again, you can grind down those joints more rapidly. So if you're being active, keeping your weight down so there's less pressure, and then doing all sorts of different activities, different movements, then you keep your body healthy and moving, keep your skeleton healthy, but you don't grind down those joints. All right, well, that's all we got for joints. Hope you have a great day and take care. Thank you.